Welcome again to Modern China, to the modern part of ChinaX. This is the week in which we'll talk about the Opium War, which in many ways is often deemed to mark the beginning of modern Chinese history. Although, as we know from an earlier module, this is a highly discussed question as to where precisely modernity begins. I'm Bill Kirby, as I think many of you will know, and I'm here with my colleague Adam Mitchell. Adam, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
We've received extraordinarily interesting responses to our queries about your views about the Opium War. Before we get to that, I just want to remind you to take some time, if you haven't done it already, to complete the pre-course survey using either English or Chinese to complete it. It would help us a great deal. We have a new section. Sounds like a reality show. It's called Meet the Learners. Can you tell us something about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So under the Meet ChinaX section in the courseware, we have a new section called Meet the Learners. And beginning this week, we plan to post video testimonials of our learners' experiences going through ChinaX. We're excited to learn more about you and to offer you a view into other people's learning experiences in this course.
Good. Now, one thing we start with, Adam, we start with some music in this.
Right.
It's the March of the British Grenadiers. What do you think of when you hear that march?
It's a good question. I hear militantism. I hear nationalism. I hear a country wanting to go to war.
Yeah, it's a march about the use of cannon and grenades and so on, of an increasingly modern sort. It's a march which shows a rising, this is one reason why I played it, because it was likely to have been played by the British in their march into China, in various places, in fact. It places the British in a historical position. The words begin, some talk of Alexander and some of Hercules, of Hector and Lysander, and such great names as these. But of all the world's great heroes, there's none that can compare with the tow row row, row 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 to the British Grenadiers. So they're placing themselves in an enormous historical moment. And they're even arguing that their success in battle makes them popular among those conquered. But let's turn to some of the questions that we asked you to consider. And we asked you first to consider, which question was it, Adam?
I think we gave them a poll. And
yeah.
The question was, who started the war?
All right, well, let me ask you, who started the Opium War? And then we'll get to their questions. Who do you think started the Opium War?
I would say that the British started the Opium War. It, of course, depends on how you define started it. The first act of hostility, you could say, one could argue that Lin's issue, throwing the chests of opium into the water was burning them was a declaration of war of sorts. One could argue that the first shot being fired is the true declaration of war. But I would say that the British began the Opium War.
Right. It's interesting. I was just this last week in Hong Kong, and a colleague there reminded me that in old British textbooks that used to be used in Hong Kong, at least in this gentleman's childhood, it was not called the Opium War, but the Commercial War. Just as the Civil War in this country has had different names depending on what state you are educated in, the Opium War has had different names over time. In any event, it's universally known now as the Opium War. And as the question as to who started the Opium War, the British or the Qing, of the responses we got, 77% overwhelming say the British, and 23% say the Qing. Although I think from the responses we have, many of those say that the Qing started it with excellent cause.
Yes.
It's not as if they were unprovoked. But that's an overwhelming, so no question, British war guilt established here, at least by the learners of ChinaX. And we have very interesting discussions. Lucy Costa writes in, Britain fired the first shot, so Britain is responsible. Wars, she says, are armed confrontations, and therefore Britain started the war. China had all the right to try to stop the flow of opium into the land. So that's a clear argument on one side.
Yes, left says, it's Britain's fault, no matter who fired the first shot. British official policy to extract Chinese wealth and to weaken the country by opium trade was the main reason for war. no matter who fired the first shot.
Very reasonable and probably shared by most professional historians. Conant writes in, both sides. Technically, the Qing started the war, but they were provoked into it by the British. Just as in 1939, not in 1839, Britain declared war on Germany, but it could be argued that Germany started the war through their actions in Poland. That's actually a very interesting analysis. We needn't belabor this point. Broadly understood, if there's a war guilt clause, as in the Treaty of Versailles after the First World War in 1919, it is with British guilt, and yet, unlike the Treaty of Versailles, the party deemed guilty, Germany, paid the indemnity. In this case, the party that historically has been proven not to have started the war, at least you have argued so, is the one that would pay a very large and difficult, very large and encumbering indemnity. Now, we also ask the question and ask you to think about this remarkable document that Lin Zexu, Commissioner Lin Zexu, sent by the Daoguang Emperor to extirpate opium down in Canton. He writes a letter to Queen Victoria. And the question we asked you to think about, does Commissioner Lin treat the Queen as an equal to the Emperor? Does he see Great Britain as equal standing with China? And then we ask you to think of whom do you sympathize most with this letter? And so we have some interesting, do you want to read a couple of our first responses here, Adam? Sure. Very interesting responses here.
So a user named Colwer first lays out the terms of respect used in the letter and the terms of contempt.
Because there are both.
Right. Mm-hmm. So trying to weigh the pros and cons, trying to balance on the scale how Lin is actually treating, addressing the Queen. And ultimately he concludes, I think he's respectful to some extent, but does not show the same deference he does to the Emperor. Does he see Great Britain as being of equal standing with China? Perhaps he does see the country as an equal, but with reference to the barbarians, the merchants he's talking about here, I think, would lead me to believe he doesn't necessarily see its merchant representatives as equal, rather as drug-peddling deathmongers.
Mm-hmm. Barbarians.
Yeah.
Even today, one might argue. Well, Chris J20M writes that Lin Zexu writes a strange letter when read from a Westerner's perspective. On the one hand, he bangs the drum on China's greatness relative to Britain, and then appeals to British conscience to cease the trade rather than to order them to cease. He goes on to quote various parts of it. And he says, I think quite rightly, it is a very hard letter to read without being moved. The opium trade brought so much misery and torment, carving a hole in the middle and upper strata of Qing society, decimating families, fortunes, and lives. One can feel the rage the writer must have borne at the injustice and glimpse the impotence he might have felt in having to appeal to the British to choose morality over profit. Choosing morality over profit is a tough sell, sadly, too often in our world. Who else have you found of interest here?
We have a user named Tom Sudman. Mm-hmm. To the question of, does Lin's letter treat the Queen as an equal, he writes, no, I think it's fairly obvious that Lin regards the Queen and her country as inferior to China and its ruler. This position is perhaps more justified given the relative sizes and histories of the two countries. So he's saying that China's long history and its large geospatial extent perhaps allows it to be take the superior position. And finally, to the question of who do you sympathize most with in the letter and why, he says the moral ground in this matter clearly belongs to China.
Terry Mack talks about how the letter is perceived and how it has to be written. I think it's very interesting that Lin had no choice but to be perceived as coming from a place of strength to do the job for which he was appointed. And I think this is an interesting point. Mm-hmm. As an imperial commissioner, he could not write a letter that differed from what was a standard form of communication from a Chinese official to an outside official, which had to have a certain sense of hierarchy and had to use for foreigners certain terms such as that would or could be translated as barbarian. There are forms of communication that in some sense surely will inhibit the interpretation in the sense, and yet its sincerity is remarkable despite the sense of formal hierarchy that clearly is behind it. Any others?
Another user expands upon that idea, or takes that idea and goes with it. He's J.M. Worsley. He writes, in terms of the Chinese worldview, where every person must be placed in the correct position so that the correct relationship is determined and thus the correct ritual be followed, it would be impossible for Lin to treat Queen Victoria as an equal. Under the strict Confucian hierarchy, even friends were distinguished by age or some other factors. So one must always stand as a superior or inferior. Do you agree with that view?
Yes, yes, and so does Dubois Halb, who writes, it's hard for me to read this and not get a sense that the writer considers himself and those he represents as superior to the addressees. When I paraphrase it in more colloquial modern terms, it reads something like, hey, the closest thing you'll ever know to a perfect morally balanced mind is really mad. You're lucky if you're dealing with me, and by the way, I have full authority to clean up this mess. What's gotten into you, Vic? He's actually not that impolite. I know you know the rules. You've always been polite and honorable in the past. What's this assertiveness all of a sudden? You better not bite the hand that feeds you. Have you lost your mind? And for that matter, did you have a mind to lose? Or blah, blah, and so on and so forth. That's a letter, happily, that Commissioner Lin didn't send. But it's a very... Now, you had interesting questions that we didn't ask, but you have asked. And I'd like us to just think about a few of them here. Were there any benefits to the Chinese people by losing the Opium War? What do you think? It's a heck of a good question.
That's a loaded question.
It's a loaded question.
I would say, well, first, who are the Chinese people? If you mean merchants, merchants maybe benefited by losing the Opium War. With greater access to opium in China, the Chinese merchants dealing in the opium trade perhaps benefited.
And in other trade, all kinds of trade.
Right, absolutely. So merchants probably had a lot to gain. If you're talking about the Qing government, probably not as happy of outcome.
Right. And if you were to make a distinction, which isn't really made at this moment in time, but would be within a decade or two in political terms, this is a war that really does weaken the Qing. And those who would seek to overthrow the Qing and restore a more Han family to the throne, restorers of the Ming, or as we'll see next week, proponents of an altogether new kind of dynasty. In that sense, one could argue the Chinese people gain by weakening the Qing, if these two are in fact an opposite. Which
absolutely. I think the popular rebellions that we'll be talking about in the future, in large response, arose in part in protest to the opium trade.
Now there's a question that a number of you ask, did Queen Victoria actually get Lin Zexu's letter? It's kind of an interesting question. You know, there is a kind of rudimentary postal service in China at this point in time, which is really for the throne and a form of communication networks. There would not be a formal public postal service until really the second half of the 19th century. There is Royal Mail, or whatever its predecessor was, but I'm not sure there was much in between. So how does this letter get to the Queen?
I imagine by boat. At some point it has to go on a boat.
Yes.
But in my understanding, there's no historical evidence that we have that tells us for sure that Queen Victoria ever actually received Lin Zexu's letter.
Right, and I don't know of any either. If any of you know that she received it and wrote a response that he never received, that would be very interesting to know. But sadly, I don't think she did receive it. But it'd be very interesting to know what her reaction would have been had she received it, because we know that British opinion on this war was deeply divided between those who were pro-war and those who were anti-opium, and who felt shame at the thought and cause of this war. One of the questions that's asked, it would be interesting to learn more how the increasing opium addiction affected the daily lives of societies and families. How do you think, Adam?
It would depend on what era you were talking about, I think. When opium first entered China, to my understanding, it was mostly consumed by the elites. It's government officials, wealthy merchants, individuals of a higher stratum. Of course, this had a disproportionate effect on the Qing government and their ability to govern, since it was indeed their officials and soldiers and individuals of power that were indulging in opium habits. However, as time went on, China developed its own endogenous opium trade. They started growing opium.
Yes.
In Western China became full of opium fields, and we have plenty of accounts of missionaries and travelers who visited there and saw fields and fields full of poppies.
And it is taxed by local governments.
Right.
And so it becomes basically a huge cash crop domestically,
Right.
Almost exclusively Chinese by the end of the 19th century, and a major source of local revenue and provincial revenue in late Qing and early Republic.
So I would speculate that in the beginning, when opium was first introduced to China, the opium trade being mitigated mostly through the port of Guangzhou, that Canton, that it would affect mostly the elites. But as time went on, and especially as the domestic supply of opium increased, it became a much larger and more systemic social problem.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Good, very good. Here's a final question that is very much worth addressing. I wonder what made the Qing accept the unfair British conditions. China had always gone through wars, crazy and unjust wars sometimes. They could go through another one no matter what it takes. Was this because the emperor was weak, or public opinion was weak? So why would the Qing accept these conditions? This is they are onerous conditions. We're opening all these ports, the huge indemnity. Why not keep fighting? Why not keep fighting? What's the easy answer to this?
I would say because then they would be fully colonized.
Well, even if they weren't fully colonized, they would be more thoroughly humiliated, one might say. I mean, one has to have some sympathy here with the Qing, as I think we have in the module. There's no way in which they could have prepared for the type of military that they encountered with the British, with steamships that could go upriver at will and bombard or threaten to bombard the southern capital of Nanjing, threatening not just that city, but the very legitimacy of the reign, the very legitimacy, I should say, of the dynasty. And to continue to fight and to continue to lose would be to continue to lose legitimacy over time. And it was cheaper to pay these guys off. These are, as we'll again see in the next module, from the Qing's point of view, the British, as troublesome as they are a disease of the skin. Soon the Qing would face, in the Great Taiping Rebellion, a disease of the heart. Better to use a little mosquito spray or whatever it takes to get rid of or to pacify those things that are nipping at you from the outside and take care of what really matters for your dynasty and indeed for your civilization, your heart, and the heart of Chinese civilization, which comes under threat just a decade or so after the Opium War.
And I would say the concession to this unequal treaty gave the Qing time. It bought them time to perhaps respond to this threat, to self-strengthen as they would try. Now, of course, what they didn't know at that time, but would later find out that, in fact, Europe, these Western threats, were a moving target, that they couldn't simply buy time and self-strengthen, that Europe would continue to grow stronger and stronger as well.
Right. There's a lot of argument as to whether this was a wake-up call to begin, and it certainly does begin the serious studying of the West and of Western armaments and Western manufacturers, and so in beginning the study of international law, which the Qing does very well with up to a point in the second half of the 19th century, as we'll see. Well, as we end this session, we'll end with a bit more of British music. You know, this is a century in which, the 19th century, not our century, in which Europe conquered much of the world, led by Britain, and the great tune, Rule Britannia, could be heard in virtually every continent. And perhaps with the exception of Antarctica, that I'm not entirely sure of. and we'll play it as we leave you in a week in which the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland may be less great by the end of the week. We'll see you next week.